Okay, we are live.
We're live.
Yeah.
Ron, what a pleasure to see you.
Good to see you, Ben.
Thank you, sir. Buddy of mine,
Yes.
right?
40-some years ago.
40-some years. Right.
Thank you.
Right. Lovely folks, thank you for putting up with last week. That was a hard business listening to climate change. On the other hand, climate change data are there, and they are things we need to know about. And I'd like to take a different tack this morning, something which for me is a little scary, but I think it's worth doing. All right, I'm going to.
Oh, your computer went to sleep.
Oh, it did. Well, in that case. Oh, sorry. Mr. Computer.
I know the feeling.
So Bill, should we just nudge every once in a while?
Let's see if I'm really clever enough to get this.
You got it now.
Okay. Cool. Okay, so what I'd like to do is to remind ourselves of why it is that climate change is something that is important not only for us, but also for the larger world, and to reflect on that by going back to Psalm 104, which is one of my very favorite pieces of the Old Testament. So today is a response. Last time we talked about the science of climate change, and we can go back and review any of those details, but I'd like to talk about how you and I change our attitudes, points of view, or not. Can we proceed to deal with climate change without changing our habits, or do we have to actually change our nature and point of view in some sense? So I'd like to talk about one of nature's responses, which was brought to me by one of the people in this room last week. It was Nate, and I will then talk about the international response and then a personal response. So let's get right ahead and go right ahead and start. Coming from Psalm 104, the trees of the Lord are well watered, the cedars of Lebanon that he planted. There the birds make their nests, the stork has its home in the pine trees. The high mountains belong to the wild goats, and the crags are the refuge of the hyrax. I had to look up hyrax. Hyrax is this cute little guy down here, which is a kind of badger. It's kind of a stone badger, as I understand it. Beautiful little animal. Beautiful piece of our world that is, of course, a sunflower. For the mathematicians among us, among you, it brings to mind Fibonacci numbers, which are these marvelous series of numbers that start with 0 and 1, and then you add together those two numbers and you get 1, and you add those two next numbers together and you get 2, and so forth, all the way up. And it turns out that series is beautifully illustrated in the sunflower. So this just reminds us of the fact that we live in a magnificent world that has beauty beyond measure. So last time we talked quickly about something which I mentioned, and that is that our growing zone has gone from a growing zone of 5 to a growing zone of 6. We can now grow things that we couldn't grow 30 years ago. And then, amazingly, Nate came up to me, Nate Engreck, who's not here this week because he's doing something else. He's on a trip, but it turns out that Nate mentioned to me something that he had been working on, and that is this marvelous little guy, which is called the green tree frog. And there he is. And Nate pointed out that the green tree frog is now migrating into southern Indiana. Interesting idea. But it turns out that he pointed out to me something I didn't know, and that is that the line we saw in that last graph, this one, corresponds essentially perfectly to the position of the green toad, the green frog, as he migrates north. So what we're learning is the science that we know is coupled in many, many different ways to the biology that we are now learning about and that Nate taught us about. So that's an interesting observation, and that is that the green frog had spread to 4 of the counties back in June of 2003. It is now spread to 8 Indiana counties, not yet to Monroe County. So here, there are lots of other things happening that have to do with climate change, and here is one other detail, and that is if you look at Lyme disease, the spread of Lyme disease since 1996 to 2014 is illustrated here, and another negative aspect of climate change, of course, is that as you warm, you also get the insects that go with that warming. One of those turns out to be this nasty tick, which is a deer tick, which does spread Lyme disease. So we have both positive and negative. We have more green frogs, and we have also more ticks. There are lots of things happening that have to do with climate change. The point is, everything is connected and interconnected. I mentioned something which is underway right now just because it's extremely important, and that is COP26. COP26 stands for the Congregation of the Parties. That's not quite right. It's called the, help me, COP. Congregation is not the right word, but it's the collection of people who get together every year. This is the 26th year, and it turns out that they are looking at several different details, one of which is a way to try to restrict the rise in temperature to something like 1.5 degrees Celsius, and that they're talking about all sorts of details, ways to do that, electric vehicles, renewables, reforestation, and so on. It looks as if we may have already lost that capability, which is sad, because 1.5 degrees C is already threatening to several different communities. What we must do then is in addition to the business of where we have to worry about adaptation, then if mitigation doesn't work entirely, we're trying to mitigate but also adapt, or do adaptation. And adaptation, of course, requires that we protect our existing communities, natural habitats, and those are things which require a great deal of effort on our part. And there are organizations here at Indiana University that are worried specifically about this business of adaptation. The organization called ERI is doing such a thing. A third piece of the COP26 effort is to mobilize the financially capable countries to begin to contribute something of the order of $100 billion a year to the poor countries so that they can begin to deal with climate change, which is taking place largely throughout the world, and of course is endangering their lives as it is ours. And then working together through government, business, and civil society is the basic idea, and this is a picture from Glasgow, and that's where it's taking place. So think government, business, and civil society just for a moment as we move forward. Well, business has a lot to do with it, lovely folks, and we talk about government, we've just talked about international government. Ultimately, business turns out to be perhaps at least as important as government with regard to dealing with climate change. And the reasons are obvious, and that is that it has the financial capability to do so, it also has the knowledge base and the technology to do it. So here is an example of a system which is set up in San Diego by a large business there, which actually does the desalination of water. It can desalinate something like 50 million gallons a day. That's huge. Is that enough? No, not enough. That's only about 8% of the total needed for San Diego, but it's a start, okay? It's an interesting start. Is it an obvious answer to the question of the water needs of the world? And the answer is no. And the reason is partly that it takes a huge amount of energy to do that desalination. It's getting less, the energy needed, but it's still a large amount of energy. So business deeply involved at all levels, and I don't want to minimize that importance. So the other part is civil society, and that's you and me. So let's talk about civil society. I had a chance to attend something called a Rooted and Grounded conference at the Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary about 2 weeks ago. And there are many interesting ideas that came out of that conference, and we're not Mennonites, but there are several good ideas that come from the Mennonite curriculum community, and I'd like just to mention a couple. Quoting from this piece by Katerina Friesen, Sherry Hostetler, the threat of catastrophic climate change has called followers of Jesus to see this as a kairos moment. I remind you that kairos and chronos are two words in Greek, both of which mean time. One is kairos, the propitious moment for decision and action, and chronos is the more common use of time, just the ticking of the clock. This kairos moment never has the divine call to choose life so that you and your descendants may live. Deuteronomy bids so clear. We literally can choose life for our descendants or bequeath them to a world that is uninhabitable. Maybe uninhabitable is a little strong, but it's getting pretty close to what we talked about last time. Yes?
Isn't that a gross distortion of interpretation of that particular verse?
How would
We're
you-
talking about obeying God, choose life, obey God, act on, if you will, action, His commandments. And now it's being, if you will, twisted to talk about this choosing life means the world becoming uninhabitable or not.
Well, I would argue that both are relevant in this case. I understand your point. Other comments on that?
No, it seems to me that it's called eisegesis. You're interpreting into the scripture as opposed to getting the interpretation out of scripture.
I think if you read the whole thing, it puts
We
it in
don't have
better
the whole
context.
thing
Well,
here.
I have the whole thing right here, so if I can read it, I think
Sure.
it
Would you read it?
helps it
Sure.
put it in that context. Starting, I'm gonna read 19 and 20. This day I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curses. Now choose life, so that you and your children may live, and that you may love the Lord your God, listen to his voice, and hold fast to him. For the Lord is your life, and he will give you many years in the land he swore to give your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So I think if you took the whole 2 verses, love the Lord your God and listen to his voice and hold fast to him, his commandments harkens back to the commandments of tending the garden.
Thank you.
So I think it's okay, personally.
Thank you for both thoughts. Okay, well, proceeding, again, this is coming partly from my understanding of the Mennonite curriculum, and we certainly are not Mennonites, and so we may disagree with their points of view, and that's perfectly fine. But I'd like to talk about 2 pieces that are meaningful to me, that have to do with this idea of the power to act for good. We are a religious, faith-based community here. You are a community here at CCC Church, and I'm in a community at Trinity Episcopal Church, and these folks are coming from the Mennonite community up in Elkhart. And the power to act for good, from their point of view, comes from a couple of different points of view. One is this idea of moral agency, which I will expand on a bit, and the other is something called political theology, which they also talk about. Moral agency is, I read here, as disciples of Jesus, we are empowered to act through concrete daily practices, clothing the naked, feeding the hungry, sheltering the destitute. And political theology, as members of a community of faith, which this is one, independent from government or business, we have the power to order society that centers on human dignity, peace, and justice. So those are the 2 underlying ideas. Let's talk a little bit more about moral agency first. These are ideas that help me, as a Christian, come to grips with being a scientist and also at the same time a person who cares about the world and about the people in the world. So it's trying to understand for my own self why it is that I have the agency, I can actually act for good without having to do an entire review of the history every time a new question comes up. Let me give you an example. Well, first let me read this bit from Isaiah, one of my favorite portions. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send? And who will go for us? And I said, Here am I, send me." And later in Isaiah it says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor." Isaiah is talking about himself. "He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom to the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners." So it's the idea that we have already, as Christians, established that there is an ethics in our world which is really important, that we take care of other people. That is part of that great commandment. Love the Lord with all thy heart, and your neighbor as yourself. Well, this is the neighbor portion of that. And one of the things that happened to me, one of the things that I began to recognize when I was attending a service just a couple of years ago at Mennonite Church, is that there was a problem. The problem was that they needed to collect, I've forgotten how much, $5,000 to send to Haiti, and the church met on Sunday morning, and within 3 minutes they had already found the $5,000. They just said, "We need 5,000. Do we need to, can we collect that right now?" And within 3 minutes they had the 5,000, and they went ahead and sent it off to Haiti. If that were my church, or Episcopal Church would have had to set up a committee, we would have had a huge discussion. It might have been months, if ever, before that 5,000 got spent. So there's something rather impressive about this idea of moral agency. We as Christians can act without having to review the betting every time. It's a really powerful idea that we've already done. We've already decided that we are indeed moral creatures, ethical, or trying to be moral, ethical creatures that are following Christ. As such, we already don't have to go back always and review the betting. Okay, neat idea. So what is this business of discipleship then? Are we disciples? And what does discipleship mean? Well, if you go back to the Latin, a discipline, or a disciple comes from the word discipulus, which means student or follower, somebody, which comes from the verb discerne, which means discere in Latin, to learn. And then the other piece of that root is the idea of discipline. It comes from the Latin disciplina or disciplina, instruction or knowledge. So those two go together. And this is, of course, one of my other favorite people, Catherine Hayhoe, who says the following: I am a theological evangelical, one of those who can simply define as somebody who takes the Bible seriously. Climate change will strike hard against the very poor we are told to care for and love, amplifying hunger and poverty, and increasing the risks of resource scarcity that can exacerbate political instability and even create worsening refugee crises. So she is talking about this idea of being a disciple, and that's something which doesn't fall easily from my lips, because I don't know if I'm a disciple of Christ. I'd like to be a disciple of Christ, but I'm not sure I am. Let's talk a little bit about political theology. This is the idea that we as a community actually work together. One of the things I noticed here under Dan's leadership is that you actually do talk to each other. That's a rather remarkable thing. I mean, seriously, you bare your souls. You actually talk to each other about the things that mean something to each other. You talk about the good things and also about the things that are harmful to you. Well, folks, that's pretty special. That means that you're operating as a faith community in the very best sense of the word. You're actually able to operate as a political element political, if you will, entity that can actually do something. You're actually able to act because you work together. That's pretty cool. That's pretty special. And that doesn't always happen either. So this idea is illustrated in many ways. It turns out the Mennonite farmers illustrated it for me in this particular way. I read this to you. These farmers were raised with knowledge of historic Anabaptist teachings on community, simplicity, and peace. It stood alongside ideas of place and sustainability. Towns migrating to the grasslands of western Siberia, for example, in 1900, with its dry climate, 15 inches a year, and fiercely cold winters, planted red clover for its nitrogen-fixing properties, did intercropping, soil tilling, improving, planted thousands of trees, and thrived. So this community, by working together as a faith community, doing something for the common good, is an interesting idea. That is, we can all operate as individuals, or we can operate for the common good. Operating for the common good, in my view, turns out to be a winner, so to speak, a very powerful strategy. You're illustrating that here so nicely. All right, there is another person that I love dearly is Sally McFaig, and she says what we really need to do is have a bit of a paradigm shift from the so-called individualistic model to the ecological model, and I define those briefly from her. The individual model is symbolized by the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the rights and desires of the individual, and the ecological model is in sharp reversal. We do not control nature, but rely utterly on it. In this picture, human beings are products of nature and depend on it for every breath and bit of food. So her ecological model is very simple. The house rules are take only your share, clean up after yourself, and keep the house in good repair for future occupants. Interesting idea. Okay, so that illustrates this idea of working in community, working together with each other as a faith community. Okay, let's talk about some very specific details that have to do with our personal behaviors. I put on the table just a couple of copies of this little book that Nora Crampton, James and John and I put together about a year ago. It's basically a list of individual things we can do, including silly things like taking shorter showers and eating bananas. We talked a little bit about that last time, and I don't want to dwell on that forever because it's not worth dwelling on forever, but there are lots of simple things that we can do that reduce our carbon footprint and indeed work in the right direction to mitigate against climate change in a very positive way. So bananas we talked about last time. It turns out, for those who weren't here, eating bananas turns out not to be so bad. It turns out that they have a carbon footprint which is far smaller than, for example, eating a 4-ounce cheeseburger, it says here. Right? So that's interesting and fun. We talked also about taking short showers. My high school buddies in Sunday school decided that they wanted to take the longest possible showers, and so I was unsuccessful in convincing them that taking short showers was a great idea. I did start them working on a little project, of course, and that is you can actually do the experiment. You can actually take a bucket, measure the water that flows out of your shower in a few seconds. You can calculate the energy saved, and you can very quickly convert that to CO2. So that's kind of nice. You can actually, on an individual basis, carry out an experiment and find out how much CO2 you're actually saving. And you can do it for the other 50 items in this little book, which is kind of fun. So the question is, do taking showers and bananas really matter? And the answer is yes, they actually do matter, and they matter for a couple of reasons. But let me first just carry you through a quickie calculation. The world is now producing about 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide a year. There are about 8 billion of us, and so that's about 5 tons a person. So each of us, on average in the world, is in producing about 5 tons of CO2, for what it's worth. Okay. So what? But it turns out the US is producing something which is larger than that. 30 tons is an estimate. I've seen numbers that are closer to 20 tons, but let's take 30 tons for a moment. 30 tons of CO2 is larger than the average, not surprising, by a factor of 5 or 6. A third of that actually comes from things we can control here at home and by driving habits and so forth. So of that 30 tons, about 10 tons is actually under our direct control. And if we actually were able to reduce our total energy use and our carbon produced by it by something of the order of 35%, that number I picked not out of the air, but because maybe Hirschland has in fact put in your little project here, reduction from 25 to 50%, so this is sort of a middle number in that range. And what you find is that you've just saved something like 3.5 tons of carbon per year per person here in Bloomington by your own actions. That's pretty nice, because that's not enough, because of course we in the United States are still using our 30 tons and we've reduced it by 10% or so, but it's not bad compared to the world average. That's not good enough, but it's a good start. Okay, so here is something which does come from your work here with your household energy program. The idea is to reduce your total energy carbon footprint by something of 25 to 50%. The way to do that is by finding the highest impact actions. You can look at the things which really matter, and then you could break them into 12 simple pieces, and I just show a few of those here. November, for example, you were to concentrate on reducing total energy use by looking at how you set your thermostat and the efficiency of your furnace. In December, you worry about buying less stuff, and in January about hot water heating. So by breaking things down into pieces, you can actually achieve enormous success goals. Another piece of that is this quick household energy conservation survey, which you have learned about from Mady. You don't need your energy bills to start, and you can compare to the average Hoosier household by simply doing this little household survey. It's really easy. You can go here, that thing you have on paper. You don't have to copy it down, but it will ask a series of simple questions like how many light bulbs in your house are LED or compact fluorescence, and then you can go on to the next question and the next question, and it turns out that you can actually get a pretty good estimate of how you compare with other households in Bloomington. So that's nice. Okay, Scott Russell Sanders is a person here in Bloomington. Do any of you know Scott Russell Sanders or have met him? No. Okay, so Scott Russell Sanders is one of my favorite people. He has taught at the university and so on. He has a conservationist credo, which I rather like. It says, our enormously productive but finite planet demands that we make caretaking our way of life, that we use the world's goods sparingly and respectfully, and that we seek our spiritual satisfaction in art, friendship, community, useful work, the pursuit of knowledge, and service to others. The earth needs our love and protection, and in return for it, will continue to give us beauty, nurture, and joy. That was written back in 2013. Lovely folks, now we're going to start our discussion, and our discussion can vary and deviate in all sorts of different directions, but I'd like to hear from you a little bit about how it is that you think about this business of reducing your carbon footprint. Is that really important, or is that something which is a detail? So here are some economics questions. Won't moving away from fossil fuels increase the price of energy? Won't more expensive energy preferentially hurt the poor? What about countries that choose not to reduce carbon? Isn't Indiana losing jobs to the coal industry? Those are some questions that one could ask about action toward climate change. There are also other questions that have to do with the ethics. Here is my conclusion, that we're obliged to move away from our own non-sustainable and climate-damaging fossil fuel use as quickly as possible, and we're clever enough to figure out how to do that. And there are a couple of examples here of fire from a year ago, and beautiful butterfly there. So opening it up to conversation, just start with, I don't have any questions to put in your hands, but I'd like to hear some comments. We have a very serious bit of science, we can go back and review the science, but the science says that yes, the climate is warming, and it's warming because we are indeed producing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. So that's the problem. The ethical response to that is, if it's partly our doing, then it should be also partly our fixing. That would be my point of view, and since it's tied so closely to the ethical issues that we as a faith community face, I suggest that we as a faith community can respond perhaps differently from a non-faith community. There are people outside who do respond as non-faith focused, and there certainly are non-faith people in your association. But we as a faith community can respond, and respond strongly and differently, perhaps even in ways that are guided by some of our Mennonite brethren. So just thoughts. I don't want to make this a long discussion, but I'd love to hear your comments. No comments.
Well, my wife will tell you I've got a comment on everything, so, but I want to hear other people.
The concept of small actions by each of us is not only effective, but it also is something that gives us a sense of accomplishment. It's very easy to throw up your hands and simply say, well, it's overwhelming. There's nothing I can do because the problem is way too big for me. I can't do anything which is substantial at this moment. And yet, interestingly, because we have moral agency, ethical agency, we are actually able to decide that this is the problem, know that that's a problem, and then act to do something about that problem. So that's an interesting detail.
Well, nobody's commented yet, so.
Ben, sorry, yes.
Tell you the truth.
Here.
No, I was gonna say, Ben, I don't know how long you've been doing all this, but from your experience of doing this for so long, how do you feel? What do you feel has been the overall response, negative, positive, to what you are concerned about, what you have presented? This is not the first time, I know. You have done it many times.
Many times, yes. Well, one of the things Ron, thank you, one of the things we've done is to work with clergy in
Yeah.
different churches with something which is called a boot camp, where you get 10 clergy together and you then talk to them about the difficulties they have as clergy
Yeah.
talking about climate. And there are difficulties because, of course, it can be a polarizing issue.
Yes.
You can imagine that even though the damage to the poor is clearly demonstrated, that they would feel ambivalent about the idea of making presentations, giving sermons on this subject, because there are likely to be people in their congregation who are not fully on board, or who are perhaps even deniers of climate change at some
Yes.
level. So the sense I have is that part of our need is to be very straightforward. That is to state exactly what's happening, and as best we can continue to update that on a regular basis, so people know that they're getting the science from today, not the science of 10 years ago when things were less clear. Things are becoming clearer as time goes on, just because there are lots of good methods to look into how things are changing. So the things are changing. They're changing faster than we thought, which is too bad. The reaction to that is that we as a community need to do things that are both governmental, business, and also private, and that each of those groups has begun to understand that needs to happen.
Yeah.
Governments are already responding in different ways. The military in the United States is particularly receptive and understanding of the need to change mechanisms and supply chains for energy and so forth. They have become one of the greenest, if you will, organizations through their efforts to change the amount of CO2 produced by the military, which is astonishingly good. Business is also remembering or finding out that they are following the trend in the sense that they are now advertising the extent to which they are following mechanisms to reduce CO2. The detail for them, of course, hangs heavily on the fact that CO2 and energy and money go together.
Yes.
And if you put a white roof on your large distribution plant, that also reduces their air conditioning costs, and it turns out their heating costs as well. So it turns out that by simply doing the obvious thing, and that is doing something that reduces their carbon footprint, they're also saving money. There are enormous things going on, of course, in the private sector as well, and one of the things that's happening among us as people is that the majority of people are beginning to understand that it is not a matter of pointing blame or finger, but finger pointing is rather a matter of responding to a problem. And responding to the problem turns out to be one that is fairly straightforward. That is, you have a choice of, as an individual person, of being involved in the process of doing small things, reducing your carbon footprint, reducing your energy use, and there are some enormous benefits that come immediately, one of which is that you save money. Is it true that you always save money? And the answer is no. There's some things where you don't save money. There's some places where you have to go where it gets really awkward to save money. That is, building that desalination plant in San Diego, for example, is not cheap. It's cheaper just to take water out of the Colorado River than it is to desalinate water. Unfortunately, if you take water out of the Colorado River, it goes to zero, at which point you have a problem, okay? So you have multiple competing pieces, and the world is enormously strongly connected. It's really hard to deal with one piece without affecting everything else. And so I guess if you ask me my point of view, which you very kindly did, Ron, I would say that we are between a rock and a hard place, and that is we really do need to respond both as governmental organizations, as businesses, and also as individuals. And I'm hearing a great deal of enthusiasm among individuals to respond. And that, if you will, the needle is shifting from sort of neutral to people who are now beginning to realize that there are several major advantages personally and also globally to responding. I think the whole issue for me is one of whether we're able to do something good for somebody else.
Yes.
Is it always that we have to do something good for ourselves?
Yes.
Or can we actually bring ourselves together as the Mennonite community in Siberia did to actually manage to do something which is good for somebody else, including ourselves? That's an interesting thought. That is, how is it that we reach the point where we as a community are doing something which benefits the community first and us second? That's an interesting piece for me. So I really like the idea that the Mennonite farmers could go off to Siberia and establish a thriving mechanism because they worked together, not because they worked individually. As individuals in Siberia, you fail. There's no question about that. If, on the other hand, you work together and you insist on increasing the quality of the soil, that you actually learn strategies that you've never had to use before in this dry climate, then by working together, you actually have something which is quite powerful. You, as a faith community here, have power that you do not have as individuals, in my view. So that's I guess, my bottom line, if I had to say it. That is that stick together, lovely folks. Use the fact that you are a faith community to get something done which you otherwise would be overwhelmed by and unable to act on. So that's the sense I have. So thank you for
I just want to say also,
Yes.
I appreciate you bringing the Mennonites into this, because back in '74, my family and I chose as intentional neighbors to live with Mennonite community in Evanston, Illinois, at Reba Place Fellowship. but to live among them and to see this whole paradigm is so refreshing from anything we have ever experienced. And then the Bruderhof in Pennsylvania, the Hutterites out, and there was such a connection of being concerned for the world in very practical ways. And one other question, as an Episcopalian all your life, how do you feel about their overview of what's happening, of what you're sharing? How do you feel they feel about this whole issue as a denomination?
Well, I don't want to speak for all the Episcopalians, but the sense I have is that they're very cerebral.
Okay.
Their response is wonderful on
Yeah,
paper.
Okay.
And your response may be different from their response because your response doesn't have to be only on paper.
Yes.
Their response is very much one of theory. It's very easy to say, here are the problems. Ben Brabson has just said to me, these are the problems. He's told me all the things are going to happen, and I'm scared to death. So, but instead of saying, I'm scared to death,
Yeah.
they will respond by saying, we need a committee to deal with that. All right, we put that on the committee. I mean, I said that earlier, but
Yeah, it's true.
seriously, they will say, well, let's have a committee on climate change. In fact, we have such a committee. The committee is called the Creation Care Committee, right? And the Creation Care Committee is designated to deal with climate change. That immediately takes it off out of the center of action. I'm not acting
Yes.
partly because I don't know how to act.
Hmm.
I don't sense that sense of moral agency. The fact that I, in a community, can act. That's a pretty powerful way to behave, and I see that happening here. And it doesn't always happen. It happens in the Mennonite community. It happens here, I'm sure. It happens in other small groups. It happens also, of course, in the Boys and Girls Club. It happens in all sorts of other collective organizations that are working together to make a better world. And they're working together to make a better world, not by doing it only for themselves. I mean, all right, there may be a piece of it which is good for themselves, but they're also thinking about the community as a whole and working as a group as a whole, which is much more powerful. So, I guess if I had a thought about it, thank you, Ron, for asking. That's where I would go. I would think about using that strategy as a community. Several different levels. Other thoughts?
Yeah, we're talking here about what we can do as individuals on small scale and
Yes.
so forth.
Yes.
What concerns me is the fact that there's a lot of work going on in large scale. For instance, the Paris conference,
Brilliant.
where the whole world is getting together to come up with solutions to climate change. But a couple problems I see with that. First of all, they're recognizing right now that a lot of the countries are not meeting the obligations that they set in that conference.
That's right.
But also, several analyses have shown that if everybody met their obligations, it still would not meet the requirements that they were trying to meet.
That's correct. That's
And
correct.
so, all this work that's being put, a lot of money being spent on something like that's not gonna solve the problem.
That's a correct statement. It's not going to solve the problem.
Yeah.
And it then shifts the attention from what governments can do to what businesses and individuals can do, and it says something which I think we know, and that is that working with 197 countries is hard business. I have sent papers into the IPCC to try to make the case for them that the IPCC is a good move. It's something that needs to happen. We are not used to collaborating internationally, but just as this group can work more effectively as a group, we as countries can work more effectively if indeed we can coordinate our activities. So what they're trying to do is to do something which has never been done before, and that's to get a group of 197 countries to voluntarily do anything. And that's really hard. That's never happened before, with rare exceptions. There are a couple of exceptions, one of which turns out to be the Kyoto Agreement, which was done, that had to do with the business of the restrictions on the use of of ozone destroying CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons. The world actually came together to agree to move away from CFCs to other forms of refrigerants, and that started in 1987 and has now basically happened to a large extent. That is, countries signed on, they decided to move to a different refrigerant. That was perhaps an easier decision because there were new refrigerants that came along that were not climate damaging, and that continues to this day. There are still new refrigerants that are better than the ones we're presently using. So that's in some ways an easier decision, but it was one where the world did come together to make a decision to do something that was costly. Switching to a new refrigerant was not easy. They decided to do that, and the result was that then the new refrigerants became less expensive because they were produced in larger amounts, and then now we're back in a situation where it looks like it works. And the ozone hole is indeed fluctuating and beginning to get better. So there are occasions when things do work. My sense is that with regard to a voluntary organization where you're trying to get all countries together, it has to go hand in hand then with the other two pieces, or it won't work. That is, it is failing at the moment, as Greta Thunberg is willing to tell us. On the other hand, is it really, really, really failing? Well, first of all, very little happens in that first week, except lots of pain and agony, and people express their points of view. When push comes to shove, it's interesting to see what actually does get done in that second week. So not to give up yet on the IPCC. My guess is that they will eventually come up with something which may not be perfect, but it will be a collaborative beginning. Think about the tragedy of the commons. You remember the story of the tragedy of the commons? Tragedy of the commons, I remind you, tragedy of the commons. You have a commons area which is used by all farmers, and every farmer is allowed to put 10 cattle into the common area, but no more. And the reason for that is because if you put in more than your share, you'll get more than your share of the grass, and then you'll squeeze out the other farmers who are trying to use that common area. So the tragedy of the commons is that everyone will always cheat. And there is some truth to that. People do cheat. So if I sneak in an extra cow into the tragedy of the commons, I will find out, suddenly I'm getting more than my share of the grass, and nobody else can do much about that because it's a voluntary organization. Okay? So the tragedy of the commons is that cheating will eventually work its way to dissolve the idea of the use of a commons, a common area for everyone. What we are obliged to do then from our ethical point of view as a community of faith is to work in the other direction, in my view. What we need to do is to say working in the common good is actually more productive in the long run than working in the private good. That is my personal point of view. That is, ultimately, it doesn't work if you're all in it only for yourself. It falls apart. So communities build and need each other, and you're one of those communities. And I'm sorry to belabor the point, but I love the fact that you're willing to listen to me, and you're not all disappearing instantly, but you will in just a moment. So why don't I shut up, and shall we call it a day? I think that's, other questions, other thoughts?
Maybe one more?
Yes.
One thing I've noticed in my life in Bloomington is the air quality. I recently started noticing that down up to the countryside sometimes. And I have my windows open, and when I start getting to the countryside, it hits me. The air is much clearer. And when I start going back into town, it hits me again. The air's thicker.
So how do we work on that problem as a community working together? If we do it as individuals, the answer is very little happens. If we do it as a community, in this case, the city is organized, hopefully, to do more tree planting in the middle of the city, to reduce urban heat island effects in the summer by using the fact that trees are a wonderful evaporator and a cooler. They also are ones that absorb various kinds of pollutants in the air. So ultimately, my response to that would be the same as my response when I was talking to the Environmental Commission in Bloomington, and that's to say, tree planting is a good idea, not a bad idea. Okay. Good thinking. Other thoughts? Sorry to overwhelm. Lovely folks. Thank you again. I appreciate it very much.
And thank you, Ben. I appreciate it. And then next week we'll bring this conversation in this class to a close, not church-wide. The church-wide conversation is ongoing, and we are striving together to be that community of faith, leaning into this issue. Ashley.
I just want to remind people that today is the last day we'll have a meeting after church in this room with Nadie and myself, where we'll go over how the program that we'd like you to sign on to, and we need about, is it 35 more households? So if you haven't signed the pledge and you want to know more, please come today. Or I think the bulletin will also have.
There's a lot more information. Every seat in the sanctuary today has that pledge on it, so you can take a look at that.
Wait. Not, you're joking, right?
No, I'm not.
So you printed out a bunch of sheets of paper to tell us to save the planet?
I did not print this out. So there's,
You may keep this if you like. If you see one you like, hold on to it.
and next week we'll be in the New Testament, thinking through what the New Testament has to say about this issue, and one of the most common objections: the earth is passing away anyway, so why do we care? It's a big objection in the evangelical world, so we'll tackle that head on next week. Thank you for those of you who are online joining us, and we